how much of a distinction does that make in your experience? The Russians clearly have a Soviet doctrine, this idea of scorched earth policy in some regard, with the way that they've, what they did with Mariupol and other cities that they did take in the earlier phases of the war. How much does that play into the operational and strategic mindset?
Well, that's why the Ukrainians are fighting like hell, because they know what happened in Bucha and Mariupol and everywhere else is going to happen in the rest of Ukraine. And so you need every person that is not working in a war factory or doing things that are necessary for the continued life of the country. Can you make better use of the human resources that you have inside Ukraine? I think you can.
This is the Global Gambit. But with that in mind, we've obviously had a very important couple of weeks with trilateral meetings between the Russians, Americans, and Ukrainians. Now, very simply, what do you think about it? I'm not obviously surprised that nothing happened, but what I do think is of note is that the second ones that finished, 2-3 days ago, were in Geneva. The first one since the full-scale invasion, which does that sort of mean that Russia is having to make some acceptance of being in Europe, or it's not, it's meaningless because it's just a place where you hold talks?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, unfortunately, I think that the approach by the Trump administration has been doomed from the beginning because they never cared about or understood the origin of the conflict. They've never been able to look at Russia and say, you are the aggressor, you need to stop doing this. And he puts all the pressure on Zelensky. So wherever these talks are taking place, that dynamic has not changed. And also from the Russian side, I've not heard Putin or Lavrov or anybody else come out and say, well, they haven't backed down off of any of their maximalist demands, and they're killing innocent Ukrainians every night in their bed. So I don't see any change regardless of the venue, and that Vladimir Putin is going to keep doing this. He has no interest in a peaceful outcome that falls short of his maximalist demands. And on the Ukrainian side, I don't know how they can give up this part of their territory that is sovereign Ukrainian territory where lots of Ukrainians live. These are not empty flats in Manhattan that we're talking about. This is people live there. And it also is critical to the defense of the rest of Ukraine. So, and I don't get any sense from any Ukrainians with whom I speak that they're like, yeah, okay, we've had enough. Let them have this fucking sunflower fields out here. I don't get that at all. So, unfortunately, I think a year from now, hopefully, if you'll still have me on, the situation on the ground is going to look about like it does right now.
If we still have you on. Well, that depends on if you show me where to get decent pretzels in Munich, I think, next time. But I agree with you in large part. I think it's worth noting that it's in Geneva, but is it a game changer? Of course not. But therefore, it kind of brings us back, and maybe you've already answered it to an extent, but therefore, Zelensky has explicitly said in the past day or so that Europe needs to be in the next talks. But as you kind of alluded to, right, it's up for Europe, maybe if they're not going to be invited, to hold their own talks. So could that be a case where you have two sort of running sets of peace initiatives, the US-led mediating ones, and then the Europeans hosting the Ukrainians, and the Russians? Because the Europeans have brought the Ukrainians to different initiatives in the past, like the EPC or European Political Community, but not the Russians. So would the Europeans really suddenly take make that shift?
Well, President Zelensky has a difficult task. He has to fight for what is in Ukraine's best interest. He's very intelligent. He can see that exactly what I just described, that where the president is, who's putting pressure on who. He understands the Russian perspective. But I imagine, and this is me only speculating here, that there are some things that the U.S. is still providing or might provide that helps Ukraine, whether it's intelligence or continuing to sell weapons to European countries who then give them to Ukraine. And so he's going to be reluctant to do something that would completely end that. So I think President Zelensky has to continue to participate in these U.S. sponsored talks, even if they're not going anywhere. At least it looks that way now. But that doesn't mean that Europe should not get stuck into this. The result of a Ukrainian collapse, if Ukraine really collapses, or they end up getting pressured into some kind of a terrible deal, Europe is going to pay the price for this, because the Russians won't stop. You'll have millions more Ukrainian refugees heading into Europe. So Europe has to accept the responsibility. Is more than just, building up your own defense. It's about giving Ukraine everything it needs to defeat Russia. And so, as Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, said, that Europe should quit complaining about not having a seat at the table. They should build their own table, and get involved somehow. Now, right, the Russians, it seems to me, have no respect for Europe. They see the Europeans are unwilling or unable to muster the political will to do what's needed to help Ukraine decisively. So this is a difficult situation. I don't see good things coming out of the current setup.
No, and I think we said that last time we had you on about a month ago, right? That the only time Putin has acknowledged Europe explicitly is in the past couple of months, when they really got under his skin about their frozen sovereign assets, and ultimately, where does he direct all his rhetoric and statements to the White House? Never to Ukraine, it's never to Europe, it's always to the White House, and shows you how Putin sees the world. But Macron has pushed a lot for the idea of a European strategic autonomy, this idea of the French and British putting troops on the ground that seems to have been a little bit more refined. But the frustrating thing I have is and I'd love you to help me understand this, is that there's a lot of statements often made, or commitments, but they're quite poorly defined, quite poorly quantified. Like when we say security assurances, what does that mean? How do we define what that looks like for Ukraine if it's so difficult to understand what the UK European US relationship is?
Yeah, well, it's a terrific question. I don't like the phrase a security guarantee. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum, we promised U.S., UK, Russia all promised to respect Ukraine after they gave up their nuclear weapons. Obviously, that didn't happen. NATO, Article 5, is as close as you can get to a treaty-based promise to respond if there's an armed attack. That's just not in the cards, unfortunately, even though I think NATO would be better the day Ukraine joined. It's just not going to happen, certainly not with this administration, and you've got too many other NATO members that don't want it to happen yet. So what can we do that would make Ukraine feel confident that if they agreed to some sort of negotiated settlement, that they would have some security, some promise of help from other countries? And right now, we're not even willing to stop the Shadow Fleet vessels carrying Russian oil out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. We're not willing to do anything to help protect them from Russian air attacks, except for some small numbers of air defense systems that are. So we're not even demonstrating now that we're willing to do things. So you can understand why the Ukrainians would be skeptical about any promises. And this phrase like Article 5, like guarantee, that is a very dangerous thing to say, because there's no way that nations are going to treat a Russian attack again as an Article 5, if we're not even willing to do the basic stuff yet. So the only security guarantee for Ukraine is going to be a commitment by European countries to help them defeat Russia and to provide all the things that are needed. That kind of a commitment, and to help them wreck Russia's oil and gas infrastructure by stopping Shadow Fleet vessels, as well as giving them the long-range precision capability to destroy refineries. Well, this is a key. I think I'm finally getting to the point of your question. if UK and France and other countries agree to put troops somewhere, if I'm the commander, my first question is, okay, what is my mission? Am I just sitting in barracks and daring the Russians to launch a missile against my barracks? Are my barracks even in Ukraine, or am I sitting in Poland somewhere? What is the task you want us to do? And for it to work, it really has to be framed as a deterrent. That means the Russians have to believe that if they violated whatever the ceasefire parameters are, or the negotiated outcome, if they violated it, there would be immediate response from this force, and there have to be rules of engagement that would allow Captain Kurzin to shoot back immediately, not have to go back to London or Brussels to get permission. The Russians will exploit this immediately, and so having real capability that could deter Russia, where Russia would say, if we launched a drone attack against Kyiv, we are going to get pounded and suffer consequences. That's what a guarantee will look like. And then, of course, helping Ukraine grow their defense industry and helping them get to where they have a very large army that's trained and properly equipped, that the Russians don't want to do this again.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians can exploit that lengthy chain of command all the way back from Kiev to Brussels and each capital. So in my mind, then, to be more explicit about the actual locations, in the sense of, like, some people have argued that Ukraine, the line of contact as it is currently, is where the front line is, and therefore where if it was frozen in a ceasefire agreement. But that's sort of in the idea that it's still a significant proportion of Ukrainian territory is under Russian occupation. And the Russians are absolutely livid that foreign forces, NATO forces, or some coalition of the willing are stationed in Kiev as a sort of security assurance. But sort of, why is that unacceptable for the Russians? It's perfectly within the sovereignty of Ukraine to decide that, right?
Exactly.
But they still will not.
Yeah, the Russians should not have the veto over what happens inside Ukraine. Of course, they'll threaten that, if any British soldier that's stationed in somewhere in Ukraine is a legitimate target, okay, that's why we have helmets and body armor, and you would assume that. But look, to me, the best model was the NATO I-4, the implementation force that went into Bosnia in 1995 to implement the Dayton Peace Accord. And so the agreement had been worked out, and a lot of work done by the military side, working with the negotiators to get to the agreement, so that you had tens of thousands of NATO soldiers in full combat kit inside the zone of separation between the Serbian forces, the Bosnians, and the Croatians. I mean, it really was a complex but a very robust implementation force, and it was there to make sure that Serbs would not continue attacking the Bosnians. And it worked because you had a clear chain of command, you had a clear mission, and you had rules of engagement that allowed any soldier to immediately use lethal force if he was threatened. And so those are the kind of questions that have to be answered for whatever might come to Ukraine. First of all, is there a peace or an agreement to implement? And then you have to be there. You cannot do it from Poland, I don't believe.
No, I think understandably the Yugoslav wars have a lot of shtick. They get a lot of flack for mistakes made, but I think that in some essences they really tried things in a way that we hadn't seen anywhere else at that time. This idea of safe zones that the UN tried to implement, and for me it was a good effort to try to mitigate conflict as much as sort of prevent it outright. And I feel that we should have built on that in the past 20 years, but anyway, or 25 years. But just on this point, one more question, and then I want to ask about the casualty rates, is simply that, Zelensky said a couple of weeks ago about some progress being made. Or no, he said this, 2 days ago, but then they talked about this, I wrote it down here, multi-tiered plan with the Russians. Again, it's quite nebulous to me. Well, it's sort of some progress has been made. In what way? How many talks do we have to say where there's been some progress made? We've gotten somewhere. Like we seem to just be going back into the talks every 20, every couple of weeks. And it's like, well, we're rehashing the same points. Maximalist demands, some concessions here. Well, we talked about it, but we didn't get anywhere, guys. Never mind. I find it very frustrating. We just seem to go in circles, right?
I think this is the nature of negotiations. When the United States finally got out of Vietnam, it was after years of negotiations, or when the French finally left Algeria. Yes, it's incredibly frustrating, especially for Ukrainians. But on both sides, the Korean War negotiations went on for years. Both sides are trying to extract and get the best possible outcome for themselves in the absence of any sort of dynamic external action. So that doesn't surprise me. And both of them are looking at the other side, trying to figure out how much longer can they keep doing this. So that's part of what's going on. Of course, we're not going to know as outsiders watching if President Zelensky or somebody says, we made some progress there. These were constructive talks. That's a little bit of diplomatic language that people use and understand. But what's not helpful, in my view, is whenever Mr. Witkoff says, well, we're 95% there. Unfortunately, the 5% remaining is the most important part. It's not like just eroding something. It's the most salient point. So I don't know how to evaluate these things. I don't think it's a good thing that we've got non-professional diplomats who are businessmen at heart. And one of the rumors going around Munich from a lot of senior people, and I've seen reporting on it as well, is speculation that some deals have been signed already between Mr. Witkoff and Kushner and Russians that would be unveiled after the agreement, and that the administration is putting pressure on the Ukrainians to do this before the 4th of July, because the president wants a big, gigantic 250th birthday of America. Here's another war I solved, and we got these gigantic business deals, and that's hanging over things. And of course, that if any of that's true, that's an awful way to think about this, and I don't think the Ukrainians will feel compelled to do that.
No, I understand. I think for me, it's just a sense of like, there's a finite list of items, right? There's a finite list of options and outcomes that we can have. And it's just sort of, how many times are we going to go around debating over the minute details, which ultimately don't make too much of a difference? But
it's the Kremlin has no interest actually in getting to an end here if they're not getting what they want. And I think Putin also, he doesn't want to have 1 million unhappy veterans come home to a shattered economy. I think Russians are dreading how this war ends. What happens when all those guys come home?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good segue into our final little segment here, Ben, which is simply that I've made plenty of videos about the state of the Russian economy. I made one just a couple of days ago about it could be entering its death zone otherwise, in that the economy is not just going to possibly collapse, but it's cannibalizing itself, right? And to your point, I think that Putin's so far in that he needs the war to sustain his economy because of how reliant it is on the production of equipment and so on, right? It's the only thing really keeping the lights on. Do you think that's true to some extent, or is it slightly overblown?
Well, of course, I'm not an economist, but that's what you just described is what I read the most, is that, because this famous war economy means that they're only doing making things or producing that is usable for the war effort. And that's not a sustainable growth kind of economy that can, for the rest of Russian society. And of course, it depends on the revenues from selling Russian oil and gas. So I think your description of cannibalizing is probably a pretty good one. Now, that doesn't, maybe the oligarchs are not being touched yet, but certainly most Russians are.
And okay, and I guess just to wrap things up, we saw the stark numbers, assessments by a couple of different entities, right, about the casualty numbers now. I mean, Zelensky has claimed that, is it 55,000 fatalities, which I obviously respect, that the Ukrainians have been fighting more effectively against a bigger force, but that is clearly underreporting, right? I think it's unfair to say that the Ukrainians have lost such little, right? Is he trying to save face?
Well, no, I think that I would trust Ukrainian numbers more than I would trust Russian numbers. But the fact is that both sides are suffering big losses, but the Russians are the attacker, and they are suffering enormous losses. Now, I always hear, well, Russia, they have a special ability to suffer. There's no oligarchs that are suffering. You can be sure of that. The Russian people have always suffered, but the elites are not. You still see them sending their kids to Milan and stuff like that. So I think that the Russians have chosen an attrition model because they think they can eventually overwhelm Ukraine. But I think Ukraine has the potential to put a lot more soldiers in the battlefield, with some changes to what they're doing now. And I'm not talking. I don't mess with the Ukrainian this age thing. That's a cultural thing that's not for anybody else to decide. But I met with a group of Ukrainians in Munich, 7 soldiers, 4 of them were women, and these are some killers. I mean, just to watch them and listen to them talk about what they do. I think there's a resource of women that would be very capable. And Ukrainian armed forces are still kind of have a traditional view of what women can and should do on the battlefield. I think there's hundreds of thousands of women that would move forward into the fight if they were given the chance to actually do that. I say that to my German friends also. They're complaining about having a hard time getting enough people. Yeah, okay, we'll attract more women into the armed forces. At the U.S., over 20% of the Army is female because we did not have enough men who wanted to do it. And now they're in every branch.
No, I agree with you. I think that the Ukrainians certainly have a more modern approach to the armed forces. But how much of a distinction does that make in your experience? The Russians clearly have a Soviet doctrine, this idea of scorched earth policy in some regards, with the way that they've what they did with Mariupol and other cities that they did take in the earlier phases of the war. How much does that play into the operational and strategic mindset?
Well, that's why the Ukrainians are fighting like hell, because they know what happened in Bucha and Mariupol and everywhere else is going to happen in the rest of Ukraine. And so you need every person that is not working in a war factory or doing things that are necessary for the continued life of the country. Can you make more better use of the human resources that you have inside Ukraine? I think you can.
All right. And I guess the last question is simply looking forward. We are exiting February and into March, although given the state of the British weather, one would not know that spring is on the horizon. What do you think will happen next? Some people have floated the idea of a spring offensive, although I feel that has gotten a little bit out of hand in the past couple of years, given it's never materialized. What do you think we should expect?
Yeah, if I hear spring offensive again, there is no such thing. I mean, I just don't see the capability to do something that's going to dramatically change the war front when the weather gets better here in the late spring or summer. From the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, I think they're going to continue to improve their ability to attack Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. I think we're probably going to see increased attacks on shadow fleet vessels out in the Black Sea by Ukrainians, and it's hard to see it changing dramatically from what's happening right now, unless there was some really significant dynamic injection of something from the outside, whether it was from the West, or something dramatic happens on the Russian side. I just don't see a big change right now.
So you think, simply put, that 26 is going to be much more of the same, and some people have said 27 could be the moment of realization for the Russian economy. Obviously, there's a lot of conjecture there, but you think 26 is largely continuing as we are?
I think this will go until Russia is stopped, and they won't stop until Putin realizes he absolutely cannot win.
Well, on that very important point there, General Ben Hodges, thank you very much for your extended time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Everyone watching, if you did enjoy the show, well, of course, you know where you can find Ben and his work across the web and on the front, in person, and we look forward to having you back very soon. But thanks everyone for watching. Do like and subscribe. Take care.